People that work in the wedding industry, have you ever seen a couple and immediately thought, this ends in divorce? Why? Story 1. Not sure if this belongs here since I'm really sure they got divorced after, but anyway. I was helping out at my parents' restaurant where a huge wedding party was hosted. I was busy serving drinks and suddenly loud yelling and screaming started right behind me. Turns out the bride had somehow found out that the groom had hooked up with her sister right before the wedding ceremony, and apparently this wasn't the first time. In her anger, she stabbed him in the chest with a dinner fork several times. We had to call an ambulance and the police. It was like hell. Story 2. I work at a hotel. I came in one night to find the wedding was already wrapped up. It was supposed to go till 1 a.m. and it was only 11, because the wedding couple had a fight and she went home with mom. At another one, they had a huge rehearsal dinner fight which spilled out into the lobby. Everyone in the lobby found out that she hated his parents, she was pregnant, and she had no idea who the father was, and a few other things. Half the guest list packed up and checked out the next day. They still got married. Story 3. All the effing time. You know how they say 50% of weddings end in divorce? I can pretty much predetermine who that 50% are going to be with about 98% accuracy. I bake wedding cakes for a living. I own my own bakery, but have also worked in a country club kitchen doing basically the same thing, plus other pastry chef duties day of weddings. I've seen them both for the tasting/design consultation and on their wedding day. I see how they interact when they're just together, but also when under stress of the big day. I've seen everything. Lots of cheating, lots of drunks, and lots of terrible mothers. Once had a mama's boy who ignored his wife when they were supposed to be having their cake tasting to cuddle their mother and hand feed her cake. His mother was not supposed to be there, and you could tell the bride was upset. By the end of it, he had kissed his mother on the lips multiple times. Divorce. Have seen a woman complain at everything her fiancé said. Any suggestions he had for what he liked resulted in him being called stupid. Anytime she'd open her mouth, he'd cower and flinch. Their cake actually got canceled like a month before the wedding, so we didn't get anything but the deposit even though we started baking it. First time I've lost out on money and I've been relieved. Once had this arrogant, D-head Turkish guy marrying into this Bangladeshi family. Bride was sweet, about 10 years older than him and came from a fairly well-off family. Generally got the impression that this being a Turk/South Asian marriage was kind of a big deal, even though they're both Muslim. But since she was 30-something, they wanted her to get married, so they allowed it. The guy complains about everything during the planning process, especially over them not serving alcohol. He's generally a dong to us, but is straight up cruel to her. Like at one point when we were meeting, I asked about her wedding dress because South Asian wedding dresses are gorgeous. She's showing me this amazing dress and he says straight up, I don't know why she picked that one. She looks fat and old in it. Every other woman is going to be more beautiful than her on her wedding day. He then shows me this dress he picked out, which isn't traditional South Asian style at all and is very Western, and basically very ugly, and makes the model in the picture look naked, it's so sheer. When she says something about how no mosque would let her in dressed like that and her traditions are important, he just sneered and said that she should get over it and her traditions weren't that important. Divorce red flag. Found out later that they didn't last a day. From the way the servers tell it, midway through the reception, guy raises his hand to ask his new bride when she asked him a question about being drunk, and she flinched and turned away, protecting her face. He grabs her by the arm and rips her around, upset. Her mother and aunt were standing 3 feet from her and lost their effing minds, realizing what must have been happening there. His response when mom started to lose her crap on him was to hit the mother. So in the middle of this very big 600-plus person Bangladeshi wedding, this 20-something outsider a-hole no one wanted her to marry anyway smacked a well-respected woman in their community. There was a brawl. The cops were called and marriage was annulled. Edit. Because so many of you are asking, baking a cake in the weeks leading up to the event is standard. You bake the sponge triple wrap and flash freeze. Frozen cakes are actually much less likely to taste dry or gross, because if you fresh bake, they'll be sitting out for days on end until they can be decorated, and they absorb whatever smells are in the refrigerator and dry out. Typically, we will also cover them in simple syrup after thawing, but before assembly, which is why bakery cakes are so much more moist than a lot of homemade ones. I've been working as a baker since I was 15, and this is very much so the practice of every place I've worked at when it comes to celebration cakes. Story 4. I've worked fine dining/catering for over 20 years, so I've worked lots of weddings and receptions. I once heard a bride at the reception during the toast say that she actually thought she was asking out the groom's twin brother on their first date, and that might actually be cute. Except, she just kept going. She talked about how the twin was more compatible and stuff like that. Then she ended the toast with, well, As nice as you are, you'll make a great first husband. I was walking past the cameraman at that time, and you can hear me on tape saying, "Did you get that? Tell me you got that." Story 5. Wedding DJ here. Had a wedding a few years ago where the groom was a total a-hole. When it was his turn to make a speech, he refused. When the bride's sister begged him to please make a speech, or at least just tell the bride she looks beautiful, he got up, took the mic, mumbled to her that she looks beautiful, and sat back down. When I left after the wedding was done, I was walking to my van with some gear, and then I saw the bride sitting on one side crying. Found out a few days later that the groom hit her 3 days before the wedding, and he tried to hit her at the wedding again when she asked him not to drink so much. Story 6. Not actually in the industry, but I have helped out a friend with a few weddings. 2 of the weddings, I could just tell they weren't going to make it. The first wedding, the bride and groom hardly talked the entire wedding. It was like they had nothing in common. And then later, the groom pretty much F's off halfway through and went home because, I quote, he was tired. So he just left his bride having to take pictures with the wedding guests on her own. He never came back that evening, so she had to greet everyone off, etc. Funny enough, about a year later, I heard they're filing for a divorce. Another time was actually last summer. Just before the wedding speeches, the groom went to go hang out with his friends for like half an hour, leaving the bride sitting there alone and delaying the speeches. Then, right after the bride and groom cut the cake, he once again went to go hang out with his friends and abandoned his wife. So she was left alone having to mingle with all the guests, and he made no interaction with her side of the guests. He stuck with his friends the rest of the evening. His wife basically had to go and beg him to come and take more wedding pictures. At one point in the evening, he actually went for a drive with his friends for about an hour, and his wife had no idea where he was. I mean, look, I get wanting to mingle with your friends at your wedding, but to not even mingle with your wife's family or friends on your wedding day seems pretty rude. Story 7. I don't work in the wedding industry, but I have a depressing wedding story. I have a friend who I grew up with. She was always gorgeous and incredibly popular with guys, and I always thought she was a great person. As I got older, I came to realize she was actually extremely toxic in relationships and did better when she was single. She had been seeing a new guy for 2 months when one day I receive a wedding invitation in the mail. Knowing her history, it was a massive red flag for me. I turn up to the wedding and it's at a gorgeous little backyard type wedding. It's spring and everything looks perfect. I greet her family and it's like I've turned up to a funeral. They're all extremely solemn, and when I ask about the groom, her mother rolls her eyes and says, "This is a mistake." Wedding commences, and as the bride comes down the aisle, her face is gray and like she would rather be anywhere else. They exchange vows while the bride does everything in her power to not touch her husband-to-be, even standing a solid meter away from him as they stand at the front. She actually cringes and looks away when he gets choked up, saying how much he loves her. When the priest announces the kiss, the bride takes a slow step forward and presents her cheek for him to kiss. No one cheers. It's just an awkward shuffling of feet and a few scattered claps. It was the worst wedding I've ever been to. They lasted for 3 months before separating. Story 8. Was working at a hotel during a wedding weekend, and the father of the bride and groom were caught jerking each other by the staff 2 days before the wedding. We all had a bit of a giggle and assumed it was some sort of misunderstanding. There were weird ideas thrown around, like maybe there's a family tradition where they hold each other's dongs while they kiss or something like that. Anyway, they're all still in good spirits and the wedding goes ahead. At 7:57 on the night of the wedding, I brought the bottle of champagne up to the room along with some other things we did for a wedding night. Normally we do this before they check in, but they were already staying in that room before they got married. I was told there is nobody in the room and the groom is downstairs and the bride is supposed to be out getting photos or something. I knock. We had to even when we knew someone was there. Then quickly open the door and walk straight in. The bride is bent over the chair with her wedding dress over her head and the best man is pounding her from behind. I just left the champagne on the ground and left. One seriously screwed up family, but they all tipped well. Story 9. I perform ceremonies as an officiant and no other officiants. The worst, in my opinion, are the weddings that are just a bad idea. The couple is young, inexperienced, and selfish. I mean, even courthouse weddings can last decades, but if you have a wedding that is clearly not planned out, they are often not thought out well. Weddings that are rebellious as a "F you, daddy, I'm 19 and I'll marry whoever I want," I give about 2 years. Especially if the bride and groom are out of sync with one another, or one just looks like this was the other one's idea, you know? Oddly enough, weddings with cheesy themes, Star Wars, Elvis, etc. last longer than the traditional styles. I have theories on that, but I don't have enough data that's not anecdotal to back it up. But I think casual weddings where everyone is relaxed, happy, and having a good time because the wedding is about celebrating rather than the ceremony will last the longest. A sense of humor helps. If both the bride and groom are relaxed and silly with one another, those last the longest. Story 10. Heard from a friend who did calligraphy that a bride came to get wedding invites, and she didn't like the usual wording of bride mom and dad and groom mom and dad invite you to the wedding of bride and groom. The bride didn't want the groom's parents' name on the invite. My mate did an invite mock-up, called the couple for a check, and the groom lost it because the groom's parents were the ones paying for most of the wedding. They didn't need any invites. Story 11. I am not in the industry, but I have a story anyway. When me and my wife were about to celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary, my family let me know that they had a pool. Now, not like a swimming pool, but a betting pool for how long we would last married. None of them had us lasting longer than a year. This year, we're going to be celebrating 19 years together. We feel like we are still having the best time together and are still best friends. The pot was never claimed. Story 12. I used to drive a limo and I did a few weddings. This one Saturday afternoon, I'm picking up both bride and groom, best man and maid of honor. The poor groom has his arm in a full cast and immobilized with a steel rod. Turns out he had shattered it a week earlier while riding an ATV. They all get in the car and the bride-to-be starts ragging him hardcore, telling him he's such an idiot, he ruined the wedding, he's such a loser, etc. She is not letting up and not letting go. Obviously, she knew about the injury, so it shouldn't have been a surprise. She was just using it to drop F-bombs and other unwholesome words in his general direction. I pull up to the church, and she and the maid of honor leap out and go inside. The best man asks if he still wants to go through with the wedding, and the poor dumb schmuck says yes, with the enthusiasm of a sleepy sloth. I just wanted to say, no, dude, don't spend the next few years with her. But he was getting out of the car by then. I don't know how it turned out, but I'm sure it wasn't great. Story 13. Worked wedding receptions. Here are some favorites. Bride started stripping on the table while the groom was outside. Bride and the best man banged in the closet. Bride lost her ring less than 3 hours after being married. Mother of the groom lit the table on fire because she didn't like the bride or her family. Groom was passed out drunk less than 30 minutes into the reception. For that one, he pre-gamed in the limo. Our bartender refused to serve him when he arrived. Groomsmen loaded him back into the limo to sleep it off, and he didn't come back that night. Story 14. I ran a fairly upmarket hotel and restaurant that sometimes hosted weddings. Made a rookie error and booked in a wedding for Christmas Eve. This should have been a warning sign, as it shows a pretty significant lack of consideration for friends and family, making them travel across the country on one of the most irritating days of the year, when everyone would all rather be at home with family preparing for the next day. They turned up 3 hours early, and the battle axe of a bride proceeded to shout at us for not being prepared, surrounded by her incredibly embarrassed but not unsurprised family. There were various other red flags throughout the night, but the main one was when the husband got blind drunk on whiskey and asked me to go to his hotel room with him and break him in as a married man. Yeah, I politely refused. Story 15. I have a friend who is a wedding photographer, a rather busy and expensive one at that, so people usually book a year in advance. So she had a bride book the wedding date and pay the deposit. Nothing unusual there. The bride confirmed the venue, also booked and pricey, and had the general discussions with her about the style she wanted, etc. They had regular meetings over the following months, but the groom was never there. A bit unusual, but not unheard of. So it's now 4 weeks before the wedding, and they have the meeting to lock down all the details, but still no groom. My friend asks about him, and the bride mentions for the first time that she isn't engaged. Okay, maybe she has a long-term boyfriend and is planning a surprise wedding. Nope, it turns out that she doesn't have a boyfriend or any guy in mind, but she prayed about it and God told her to trust that he will provide a groom for her. So in the end, no groom magically materialized, and there was no wedding. So in that case, the marriage actually lasted 0 minutes, and we were all sure that it wasn't going to work out. In fact, at the time, we had some running jokes about her meeting a guy on a date and asking him if he wants to go to a wedding with her next weekend. Story 16. I work catering gigs in Florida. The bride was being super mean towards the groom during dinner and the reception. Like a sarcastic, "You should have known to do that already, dumbass" tone. Our crew figured, yep, this is a short marriage. After the obligatory dances and dinner had started, the groom came up. He tipped the DJ, the photographers then came over and tipped our crew way too much. He thanked us sweetly and said that he was going to skip away and drive down to the beach for a few minutes while the party continued. He never came back. Next day, we were told by the bride's family the sheriff found his car, the groom's body, and a gun down by the beach. Story 17. I bake wedding cakes and cookies, but this happened before I was in the business. A week before the wedding, bride was talking all about how excited she was to get married because that meant she could finally do drugs. Groom was confused and asked for more info. Bride was like, well, they say when you do drugs, you should do them with someone you trust. She planned on doing them on their honeymoon. When he straight up said no, she threatened to call off the wedding. He said fine, call it off. Wedding still happened, she gave in. But 3 months later, she took their 7-month-old daughter to a drug party at her sister's while the groom was working. He found out about it, showed up at the house, everyone was passed out, and his daughter was screaming, crying on the bedroom floor. He took her and left without a word to anyone, packed his bags, and never contacted the bride again. Story 18. One of my brides was nervous and got so drunk before the ceremony that she had to be helped down the aisle. Then when the ceremony was over, instead of kissing the groom, we now pronounce you man and wife, she licked him from chin to eyeball. She fell during the recessional and knocked over a waiter carrying champagne. She couldn't be in their post-ceremony photo shoot because she kept falling. When it was time to cut the cake, we couldn't find her. Our staff went to her hotel room and found her covered in her own vomit, still in her wedding dress. She had the audacity to ask for a refund after all this. Yeah, they're divorced now. Edit. This was actually a symbolic ceremony and they were legally married beforehand. Overall, the situation was sad. Story 19. I'm a photographer and I've shot 3 weddings because I hate them and they're not for me. Bless you guys who do it, but it's too much work and too much drama for me and not worth the money. Anyway, one of the weddings, the groom called the bride unattractive. She was stunning and used to model, was maybe a size 2, and he was cute but generic cute. He kept taking shots of vodka with his boys and asked for a full-on photo shoot with his mom. He was definitely a mama's boy because mom was hovering, but you know it's bad when mom suggests that maybe he take some photos with his wife. He told me to shut up every time I redirected, so after the 3rd time that happened and he flashed me his junk, I started packing up. When he started yelling at me, I just told him no one talks to me like that and I'd send them a refund. I knew right then that it wouldn't last. He started crying and said he'd behave. He did, but it didn't matter because 2 weeks later the marriage was annulled. No one wanted the photos. I was paid in full for photos that no one wanted. Bride's dad had paid me and tipped me well, too. When I offered to refund him half anyway, he said the bride knew when the groom yelled at me and cried that it wasn't going to work, so I earned it. I guess the whole family was trying to get them to call it off. Story 20. I'm a wedding photographer and the first red flag was how much flipping money they were spending. They had multiple venues. One was a golf resort. Really fancy schmancy. Could have bought a really nice car with that kind of money. Like down payment on an expensive home kind of money. Second, when I showed up to do the getting ready shots in their house, the husband's family was really nice to me. Almost treated me like a family friend. Whenever she was brought up, his family would look at me and make a face or roll their eyes, obviously not happy with his choice of lady. It seemed implied that since they had already had a kid, that I guess he has to, which is kinda sad. I had half a mind to tell him that he didn't have to get married if he wasn't happy, which I may have implied very gently. Not professional, I know, but she was a monster. Not just the day of, but even after. In my opinion, she treated her new husband very poorly. Right after the ceremony, they were outside and she was already yelling at him about something. Just checked and they're still married. But according to her posts, she's anti-vax.